Yes, yes. America is bankrupt. Oh, yeah.
With renowned investor Jim Rogers, I asked him if U.S. lawmakers should be concerned that three credit rating agencies now are warning about the debt. Here was his response.
What are the rating agencies doing? America's already bankrupt.
Will not ever surmount our fiscal problems until we amend the Constitution. We must have a balanced budget amendment.
The debt we are carrying at this moment is pulling down the economy.
It's going to be bad. I mean, unfortunately, we've spent ourselves into bankruptcy.
President Obama will appear later this morning to warn against the next budget crisis that is coming fast.
If we don't act, the growing debt will eventually crowd out everything else, preventing us from investing in things like education or sustaining programs like Medicare.
I have a question for you about the federal debt. We have $27 trillion of federal debt now. If we have another stimulus bill out of Congress, are you worried that the entire amount of federal debt will be too large for us to pay off in a sensible way?
Well, you and I talk about federal debt a lot. I know it's on your mind. It's certainly on my mind, David.
Thank you all very much. It's a very important day. I'll sign the single biggest economic relief package in American history, and I must say, or any other package, by the way. It's twice as large as any relief ever signed. It's 2.2 billion, but it actually goes up to 6.2 potentially trillion dollars. So you're talking about a 6.2 trillion dollar bill, nothing like that. And
What the fuck is going on? It's all about the he said, she said bullshit. Hey, look at this! Donald Trump! Donald Trump taking down Mr. Graham! Oh my God! The hostile takeover!
What did I say? Fucking clown show. Welcome back, and first of all, many thanks for all the views, subs, and encouraging comments. For this episode, I chose the subject of so-called national debt, budget deficits, because this one is the most abused, imagination-catching, intimidating, misunderstood platform the evil clowns use to push various agendas. Those billions, now trillions thrown around, suppose unbearable financial burden put on our children and grandchildren, inevitable tax hikes to pay for this all can really stress responsible people out. It's a scary picture after all. This is why it is so crucial to come to the real understanding of what these economic/financial variables really are. Fear doesn't help making informed decisions, indifference either. So without further ado, let's get to it. Accounting rules for the sake of budgeting or keeping track of expenses and inflows oblige financial planners to report ex post results and project de facto ex ante conjectures of how given organization looks, probably is going to look financially in a certain period of time, most commonly a solar year. Inflows exceeding outflows give us surpluses, outflows exceeding inflows, deficits, and cumulative results since the accounting commenced gives us so-called national debt or surplus. This second situation is much rarer than the first one, but when it materializes itself, it does so in the form of so-called national wealth funds, the best known being Norwegian or Qatari ones. Okay, and it's not that Norway doesn't have national debt. They do. The government still issues bonds to satisfy, for example, market demand for risk-free financial instruments, or there are some liabilities incurred in the past that are still not extinguished. But basically, government is in surplus. The nation as a whole is in surplus. The first thing coming to mind is surplus guys are doing great, and the deficit ones are bankrupt losers, right? Well, stuff is not that easy and straightforward. When we look at any given state in separation, we can divide it into three parts. Let's call them domestic private sector, domestic public sector, and foreign sector. All it really means is that, for example, in Poland, demand can originate either from the overall government or public institutions, private agents like households, businesses, corporations, or from abroad through exports. Imports are demand leakage. Spending of one sector becomes income of another, and when all three are bundled together, the balance must be zero. Let it sink in, because it's important. This identity is formally known as sectoral balances, developed by British musician come economist Wayne Godley. Now, when we are aware of the above, I can move on and explain why some countries can be in deficit for ages. For example, UK hasn't had a balanced budget really for at least 300 years. Maybe with some short periods of surpluses, but way more often with giant deficit spikes, like the ones during Napoleonic Wars. And some get in trouble and fucked over by IMF or the past imperial equivalents of it, like cartels of City of London banks, immediately. Another crucial point to grasp is whether we are talking about currency using or producing entity. This is where the real difference is made. So-called sovereign currency issuers simply cannot go bankrupt or default on their own financial obligations unless out of their own choosing. There are levels to this status, and the really sovereign countries are very few. I would say only two, meaning United States and United Kingdom. The farther we go down this financial pyramid, more constraints get attached and slack gets shorter and shorter, all the way to the complete financial oligarchy's beach status, when the spending power is limited as much as we limit our little children. One thing must be clear: monetary sovereignty is the sovereignty. When this one is missing, all the rest means dick. United States really doesn't give a flying fuck about anything. Rules for the ones below do not apply to Washington. As simple as that. They transact solely in their currency, with zero fucks given to exchange rates, simply print and pay for stuff. Mercantile vassals fight for export surpluses, to which we will come back shortly, denominated in USD, and if they don't like something, there is simply nothing they can do about it. Pile of pseudo-legal mambo-jumbo, and in the end of the day, there is just brute force and a credible threat of violence that keeps the status quo going. It's always been like this. It's always been this way.
You see, in this world, there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns, and those who dig. You dig.
Old-style mercantile system where countries fought for as big as possible gore hordes, simplifying things, is replaced by the one where participants of international trade accumulate surpluses, mainly in US dollars. Very few can escape this system. Sovereign currency issuing country, contrary to popular belief, first spends money by instructing its central bank to credit private bank accounts, and taxes later. By the point of logic, money to pay taxes comes from government spending. There is one oversight in this statement. I am well aware of it. It's not the time to go into details to clarify this now, but I assure you, in essence, it's logically true. Why the fuck do they tax us then? I bet this question immediately comes to your mind, so I am front running here. Government has to impose tax obligations in order for its otherwise worthless fiat to be accepted by market participants in exchange for the fruits of their labor. Government hit me with tax obligations, so now I better get very busy and figure out where and how to get these tokens to extinguish them with, or lose a house, freedom, and whatnot. Initially, only government has them. We do not print dollars, pounds, etc. ourselves and get into severe trouble if we try to. Over 90% of money supply is created by commercial banks extending loans, but they do it with the license, and it's, in a sense they are government agents. Bank deposits are accepted in payment of taxes, so I need to rephrase the above statement. Money to pay taxes comes from the government and its agents spending, lending. This was the oversight I mentioned, but really it's definitely a subject for the separate episode. Think about giant legalized extortion, because in the end of the day, that's what it is. Government is the most powerful fuck on the block. If they only limited themselves to spending without taxing, currency would soon hyperinflate due to its oversupply, so demand management is another function. Forget infinite regress. This is the core reason state money gets current. This was a very important piece of the puzzle. Countries with their own currencies spend first, tax later, so as such are not dependent on tax revenues, foreign loans to achieve their financial goals. At least they shouldn't be. Should is a useless word, so in reality, it is of course not always the case. Various restrictions and legal institutional constraints apply. The lower down the pyramid, the more. We already know that Americans spend what they want, on what they want, when they want, how much they want, and wherever they want. You get the picture. There is no IMF or World Bank to tell them not to. These institutions are de facto branches of Treasury and Defense departments, respectively. UK is next. In general, they can do pretty much what they want with some drama attached to keep the pretense. Since commodities are not priced in pounds, the Brits can import themselves some inflation via price of imports when pound gets low. With Brexit, they cut the last remnants of bullshit institutional restraints. How is it going to dig itself out? By fucking instructing Bank of England to credit some accounts. Not to mention it doesn't have to dig itself out of anything. The first and most important constraint that all countries are subject to, besides really the two above, is the current account with its biggest component, the trade balance. Let's come back to the sectoral balances and take Poland for example. Since we are not in a euro gutter hole yet, our corrupt government still spends first and taxes later, but its freedom to do so is still limited by self-imposed legal constraints, e.g., public debt limit or EU regulations regarding the same public debt and annual budget deficit, 60 and 3% rule. This really means dick, because when crisis hits, spending goes through the roof and revenues through the floor. Bullshit lockdowns are the best example. They just printed 100 billion PLN to mitigate the mess they created in foreign orders, recording a record budget deficit despite the fact that they voted in the balanced budget bill for the same year. Quite a fucking miss. That's why I said budget projections are conjectures. Real numbers are only known ex post. When they fuck the economy up in purpose, just like they are doing right now, it's a wild ride. But in, let's call them normal times, European Union can try to enforce those limits, threatening to cut so-called EU funds that we do not need at all in the first place. But again, it's another story. So clowns in Warsaw are in theory constrained. This would be a cap on government part of demand, spending limits and tax revenues, or in other words, Inflation. Private spending is naturally limited by the ability to earn funds or borrow them. All private agents are currency users, so they have to obtain funds prior to spending them. The same principle applies to cities, provinces, states, or parts of political unions, like, for example, Scotland. In a certain point of time, people cannot earn or borrow more enough to keep the economy expanding, or in other words, GDP growing. That's why demand is imported or the goods and services exported. Thereby, economy can grow without government and the private sector over-indebting themselves. Inflows of foreign exchange keep the upward pressure on the local currency. Norway is an interesting example. Persistent budget and current account surpluses or demand imported from abroad, with private debt somewhat elevated but not something unusual in the so-called developed world. Norwegian state puts lots of money on the side and invests heavily worldwide. For example, in the UK alone, they have circa 85 billion USD. They are propping up foreign asset markets and are subject to stock market losses, but still way better than simply stealing the surplus, as is the case in the vast majority of commodity exporting countries. The way I look at things is financial oligarchy, mainly Anglo American one, is always ahead. Now we can proceed and see why Greece, Italy, Spain are pretty much fucked. Germany is doing alright. Argentina goes bankrupt for the 100th time. Turkey records high inflation again, etc. Before 1999, or when euro was implemented, by the way, I remember clearly as day when my friend drew out €2 coin out of his pocket. It was the first time I saw this debacle live. By the European nations traded among themselves in their own currencies. Italians were very efficient in spending, creating lira, much less efficient in taxing it. So naturally, currency was steadily trending lower against Deutschmark due to inflation, and this devaluation gave them an edge in exports, at the same time putting brakes on the Germans. Usual bankruptcy bullshit, much the way we see in the US or UK today, erupted from time to time, but the economy was growing, people were employed. Similar mechanics were at play in Greece, but to the even higher degree of corruption and disorder than Italy. So the inflation was higher, downward pressure on drachma was stronger. Contrary to Italy, Greece is not an industrialized nation, so the natural devaluation of the currency due to lack of high value-added income from exports was stronger. But again, economy was growing, people were employed, nobody sucked IMF's or Brussels dick for money. Simply saying, countries were keystroking the currency to existence and taxing it later. After adopting the single currency, this was no longer possible. Funds had to be taxed or borrowed first. In reality, member states became provinces, Germany included. This brings us to another crucial concept, or foreign debt. Foreigners holding bonds doesn't make the debt foreign. Financial liabilities become foreign when the debtor doesn't control or create currency in which they are denominated. My debts are foreign because I can't just keystroke numbers to my creditor's bank account or hand him her printed paper with appropriate digits on it and cancel my obligations. I have to earn them or borrow elsewhere. Completely different paradigm, isn't it? At first, there were no problems. To the contrary, prosperity arrived. Interest rates were adjusted to German levels, banks provided credit, private sector demand was strong, tax revenues were high, Greeks grew economy this way, didn't care about exports. Music was clean. Things changed in circa 2008. Suddenly, financial institutions, mainly French and German, noticed that Greeks are not Germans and demanded higher premiums on provided credit. So-called premiums versus German bonds exploded. Keyboard to keystroke themselves out of calamity was no longer available, and so-called sovereign debt crisis erupted. Word sovereign is a fucking joke because the crisis erupted because the countries were everything but sovereign. Suddenly, the whole bunch of European states realized they are 100% dependent on foreign debt.
You're fucked.
Public spending had to be cut, driving up unemployment, killing two demand engines, driving growth simultaneously. Efficient Germans kept their wages low and dominated export markets. So the third engine was dead too. Think of it this way. Who in their right mind buys Spanish Seat for the price of BMW? I am purposely simplifying things, but you get the picture. IMF, EU, World Bank, or so-called Troika, was called for the S-raping of the Greeks, euphemistically called rescuing them. In reality, it weren't Greeks needing help, but the German and French banks that lent them money. The rest is known. Germans fared well, so were Nordics, because they had the third export engine running, keeping the economy funded via this channel. EU debt limits were suddenly enforced.
We talked about this, and I explained to you that there was the possibility you might have to take some kind of loss. Yeah. I think I want my money back.
It's export or die in the European Union. In short, that's why UK can run deficit for 300 years and Greece is fucked after not even a decade. Post World War I Germany, burdened with reparations payable in foreign currencies, at the same time deprived of its main export providing productive capacity, able to supply this foreign exchange or Ruhrland. Effect, Germans forced to dump their currency on the markets to buy dollars or francs, causing hyperinflation. One way of defaulting on one's debt, destroying society in the process. Modern Greece, forced to cut spending in order to obtain foreign funding, causing mass unemployment, destruction of infrastructure. This is so-called internal devaluation. Venezuela, depending entirely on its oil sector to run the economy, or so-called purchases, borrowing dollars, later stolen by the corrupt oligarchs. After dropping the prices of this commodity, dumping bolivars on the market to buy USD, hyperinflating in the process. Oligarchs taking their money and run to Miami or French Riviera to enjoy themselves or the yachts again with the ordinary people holding the bags and eating shit. Yeah. Argentines pegging the currency 1 to 1 to US dollar, losing export competitiveness in the process. With this gone, inflow of dollars gone too. Effect, defaulting on 1 to 1 convertibility promise, robbing millions of their savings, wreaking havoc in the country. List goes on and on. And in the current Agenda 21 bullshit corona induced global depression, we will see an accelerating wave of defaults, bankruptcies, etc. So, to summarize, is America bankrupt? No, of course not. They don't peg dollar to any other currency. Others do the opposite, but it doesn't concern them. Let the others fuck themselves over. What the fuck do we care? They borrow, but what they actually do is not borrowing in the first place, but is the topic for another episode, only in their own currency. So the act of repayment boils down to keystroking digits into existence. Burden is not put on future generations. Any tax hikes are not necessary to pay off so-called debt. For the reasons I explained above, they can increase taxes, push some agenda, blaming deficits, but it would be bullshit. Okay, and it also should be understood that exports are real goods and services sent out of the country for others to enjoy, while imports work in opposite way. Real wealth of the nation is what it produces, plus what it imports, minus what has to be exported to pay for the imports. What about all these trade surpluses parked in American bonds by, say, the Japanese 30 years ago? When the bonds mature, Fed will simply credit Japanese account on its own balance sheet, and the cash they will get is not going to have the same purchasing power than it did 30 years ago. Do Americans care? No, of course not. They don't give a fuck. The same applies to the Chinese or any other surplus nation. Okay, it's been a long episode already, so it's time to wrap things up. I didn't tell the whole story, of course. Things are complicated, not black and white, but my intention for this episode was to show that not not all deficits are equal. Some countries can do more than the others, and there is much more to this topic than flashed and shown on bullshit mainstream media. Okay, bye everybody, and see you soon, hopefully.